Hi, I'm Jed Butler, CEO of I-9 Intelligence. I'm here with Eric Board of Morgan & Lewis, one of the preeminent business immigration attorneys in the United States.
Good to be with you, Jed.
So why do people call you?
Goodness, lots of reasons. Lots of reasons. My clients are employers, and they are calling for any variety of reasons. It could be that they have a discrete question with respect to how to complete an I-9, or are the documents that are being presented by this employee acceptable evidence of eligibility to work. But usually it's going to be a little bit more complex than that. Lately we've been seeing a lot having to do with automatic extensions of various types of work authorization, early terminations of types of work authorization. When is somebody eligible for an auto extension or not? And whether the employer needs to take any type of action as a result of whatever the person's employment authorization happens to be.
What would you say are common mistakes that you see businesses make related to how they handle their I-9s or eVerify?
Well, one of the most common mistakes is that they just don't do them. Now, my clients generally are more sophisticated than that. But so I have different groups of clients. I have my clients that are just regular kind of stable clients of our practice.
Yep.
And they are usually fairly compliant, usually fairly sophisticated, and their questions are going to be a little bit more one-off. But lately they've been asking about audits and what they can do to make sure that their I-9 programs are compliant and that they're getting it right. So I'll do a lot of counseling on that. I'll do training on that. And then we will do audits of their I-9s, maybe a sample of them or comprehensive, depending on the situation. The more challenging, from a compliance standpoint, the more challenging situations I'm seeing lately are more in the transactional space, where we as a firm are representing either a seller or a buyer or a lender in a transaction. And I-9 compliance has become a much bigger issue in due diligence than at any time in my practice previously. So we'll be looking at I-9s to...
You're talking about mergers and acquisitions,
in
private equity.
Right.
Yep.
Whether it's private equity coming in or whether it's a bank that is being asked to finance a transaction, and they want to know about a company's I-9s, or we'll represent a seller that knows that it's going to need to deal with these issues before it can go to market, and they want to clean up house before they put themselves out there.
That's fascinating. So you're seeing even banks wanting to see some kind of audit of a potential business before making an acquisition?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, banks where they're acting as where they have a financing role.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's interesting. And when you do an audit for a business, say it's for M&A or just independent audits where a client reaches out to you, what does an audit around their I-9 compliance look like for you guys?
It's really kind of situational, right? Because sometimes they want us to go deep into the weeds. Sometimes it's a more high-level inquiry, but at a minimum, we're going to ask, do you have I-9s? And we'll do some comparison of a current payroll or a current number of employees and see whether we have I-9s that match the payroll. Sometimes we'll typically not do a full-blown audit, but we might do a representative sample. I might tell the company, send us every I-9 for people whose last names end in A through D. Okay. And we'll look at those and eyeball them. Do you have them? Are they compliant? Are they technically deficient? Are they substantively deficient? And then it goes from there. Do they remediate before they go into the transaction, or do they just take into consideration, from a valuation standpoint or a planning standpoint, what the I-9 show?
I imagine I've seen businesses who are still doing their I-9s with paper. Mm-hmm. In fact, I spoke with a large energy business that everyone would know the name of them recently. And they're operating out of multiple refineries and still doing paper I-9s out of filing cabinets in multiple locations.
Right.
What would you say to a business like that? Like, where would they start?
Where would they start? I don't have any personal objection to paper I-9s. I mean, in some respects, paper I-9s are easy to deal with. if you have good processes in place and good personnel in place. But once you get into a situation where you have turnover in your HR personnel or corporate change, then electronic systems, in my experience, can be helpful. Where I have seen companies get into trouble is in the M&A space, is when they are acquiring and they are getting the I-9s from the target, and those I-9s come to them in electronic form, but they don't get the audit trail. And then I'm doing my due diligence audit for them, and I say, well, these PDFs of forms look pristine, that's great. Where's the audit trail that goes with them? And they say, we didn't get that.
Right.
And then I say, well, then you don't have I-9s.
I think in 2023, DHS and the Department of Justice issued the memo around electronic solutions or HR software.
Right. A not particularly helpful memo. It says that it needs to be compliant and that there needs to be an audit log or an audit trail. Not a whole lot of detail or in terms of what that represents. But from a common sense standpoint, I think people who think about this can kind of get it. The government doesn't want to see forms that could have been created by anybody who was just looking to create forms. They want there to be something substantive to back it up. And I get that.
Yeah, it seems like HRIS platforms sometimes will miss that audit trail component, like you're talking about.
In my experience, there are I-9 products that fall into basically two camps. There are those that were created by I-9 professionals for I-9 compliance purposes, and that's what they do. They do I-9s. They don't try to be all things to all people. They don't try to add on a module for this or a module for that, or to necessarily integrate into a company's HRIS. They say, you were doing it on paper, there's an electronic solution, and here's the electronic solution. And here's the audit trail. And I'm very comfortable with those types of platforms. Where I get less comfortable are the module add-ons, some of which are very good, some of which are super compliant and they've got all the bells and whistles and they're fun to use, and some of which are just not. They succeed in getting the client to buy the module, but they don't necessarily help the client be compliant with their I-9s.
Yeah, that's a constant challenge for us, is how do you position related to, fancy, shiny things, as opposed to things that stand up in the scrutiny of an audit.
Right. No, that's right. Do you want the, I don't know, what is it, the Ram truck, or do you want the Range Rover EV? And
one may be more reliable than the other.
Right.
Yeah. And for people who may not know, I've certainly talked to folks who, this is a little bit of a foreign language. What is an audit trail?
What is an audit trail? Every time somebody touches that electronic I-9, there should be something happening behind the scenes that records that transaction. It shows who accessed it, when, and what they did. Because what the government wants to know when they're looking at a paper I-9, a printout of a PDF, is how do we get that? Did somebody just sit down and type in and create a whole bunch of data and say, here's the form? Or is there some integrity behind that form? And the audit trail is a list of transactions of who got in, what they did, when they got out, IP addresses and names, and tied to specific login credentials, so that it is kind of it can be valuable from an evidentiary standpoint. If you're thinking about it as a prosecutor or as an investigator or as a lawyer, there needs to be something that allows the government to trace that I-9 to the people who were involved in creating it. And that's what the audit trail functionally accomplishes. I think you were asking me, what are the most common issues that we see? And we see them on a continuum. One end of the continuum is companies that just don't have I-9s at all. And that's easy to diagnose, and you know what to do. You get the I-9s. But then we see a variety of issues in that muddy middle. before you get to pristine, which is the other end of the continuum. And there it could be that there were people who thought they were doing I-9s remotely, and they thought they were doing I-9s correctly, but they were doing them remotely. And the person who was who was signing the I-9 is not the person who looked at the documents. So you have a procedural issue there that's non-compliant. Or you might have people who just put the data in the wrong place. Now, if you're using paper, that happens all the time. If you're using an electronic solution, the software corrects for that. So it keeps you from making those stupid mistakes that you can make on paper. So when we're dealing with clients who have created their I-9s electronically, we're much less likely to see those types of errors. But then we'll also see people or companies, employers, who think they're accepting acceptable documents, but they're not. It could be that they accept a restricted Social Security card, but in a drop-down, they still select unselected Social Security or unrestricted Social Security card. So we'll see deficiencies like that, or accepting documents that were the software doesn't help with, but if you have a trained eye over the years, you can start to spot the fraudulent documents as well. That's a much different issue, a much more sensitive counseling issue with clients. The first line of defense for any employer in this current environment is going to be to have compliant I-9s. There's a lot of talk, a lot of concern about immigration raids and ICE showing up at workplaces. That's happening in really very isolated instances. That doesn't really have to do so much with I-9s, though some of those raids might be triggered by prior I-9 investigations where the government determined that this was a location that was employing a lot of people who presented documents, maybe that the employer has I-9s, but that the documents the employees presented were fraudulent, and that the employer maybe did or did not know that there were acceptable documents. But the first line of defense is to have I-9s on file, properly completed I-9s. If an employee presents a fraudulent document as evidence of identity or eligibility to work, and the employer does not know that the document is fraudulent, and a reasonable person in the employer's situation would not know that the document was fraudulent, then the employer has a very, very strong defense to any claim that the company was knowingly employing people who are unauthorized to work. The employer is a victim, in a sense, of having been defrauded by the employee who misrepresented his or her identity. So employers' first defense against an immigration-related investigation or an immigration-related enforcement action will center on whether that employer knowingly employed people who weren't authorized to work. And then secondarily, or perhaps primarily, whether that employer has I-9s on file for those employees. And employers who do have I-9s that are properly completed based on documents that they reasonably believe to be genuine at the time that they accepted them, may still find themselves on the receiving end of a notice of investigation, may still find themselves being investigated more vigorously by the government in this current environment. But they will have the defense to some of the more, to many of the charges that create the greatest exposure. You've got companies of a variety of sizes, right? You've got your mom and pop startups where they're dealing with everything under the sun in terms of what their business obligations are, including the I-9. And then you have very sophisticated companies also that might have a team of people who are dedicated to I-9s. But most companies have HR teams that are overworked. And they have lots of responsibilities, ranging from onboarding to recruiting to benefits administration, personnel actions, and all of the day-to-day stuff having to do with HR. Oh, and by the way, do the I-9s. And those HR professionals, well-intentioned as they are, don't have the bandwidth frequently. And you know, you look at the I-9, right now it's a one-page document, right? But before the current iteration of the I-9, it was a 3-page document with 19 pages of instructions and a 200-page manual, plus a website in addition to the manual trying to explain to HR how to complete this form properly. And it's a minefield. It's a minefield for HR, as determined as they are to get it right, and as certain as many are that they are getting it right. It's only when an audit is performed that they realize that, notwithstanding their good intentions, notwithstanding what they thought they knew, there are still mistakes being made. Electronic platforms help avoid a lot of the more common mistakes that we see.
What would you say are the major risks of non-compliance?
The major risk of non-compliance is that a company gets a notice of inspection and isn't able to respond in a compliant way. And there, the exposure is financial, certainly, because you can be sanctioned up to, what, now roughly $2,900 per missing or
just
deficient
paperwork.
I-9, just on the paperwork piece. And then add on to that, you know, another $5,800 or $5,900 per person if it turns out that the people were not, or the workers were not authorized to work. And if you don't have an I-9 for that person, then there's a presumption that you knew that the person was unauthorized to work, and the employer needs to overcome that presumption. So it gets risky. The numbers add up really pretty quickly. Yeah. There are three, there are a lot that come to mind, but here are three. One is a very sophisticated energy company that grew through acquisition, and their I-9s are a mess. If legal didn't know it, HR thought that they were under control because the person who had been doing them was supposedly doing them right. But then they looked under the rock, and it was a pretty ugly scene once they looked under the rock and saw what was crawling in. And they got a notice of inspection. Responded to the extent that they can, and are waiting to hear what the outcome of that will be. And then that process will go forward. We have...
Could that affect an acquisition?
Could it
break a deal?
Well, that's my next scenario, okay? So I have and this is real, this is within the past week, seller in an industry that historically employs a lot of unskilled workers. The company there are private equity investors out there who are looking to consolidate in this industry and to make purchases. And our client in this case is the seller. We typically will be representing private equity, but sometimes we represent the seller. And the seller went to market, and the deal busted 3 times because they looked at their I-9s and they were a mess. And they came to us after having failed with 3 other attempts, and they said, we have a buyer. And the bank came in and said, before we finance this for the buyer, we want to have some assurances on the I-9s. And it was the seller's bank, and they still couldn't get comfortable with the deal because the I-9s were a mess. So now we're going to spend the next 4 or 5 months working with the seller to get the I-9s to a point where they think they can go to market with the company and overcome this issue. And they're not going to be 100% compliant, but if they get to 80 or 90%, then buyer might be a little bit more comfortable, and the risk is there, and what they need to put in escrow or put in a holdback is a whole lot less than what they need right now for a company whose I-9s are a mess.
So imagine if they had taken the time to get things in good shape before. They probably would have changed, the whole...
Then who knows what would have happened with deals 1, 2, and 3.
Right. Yeah. But do you think NOIs I-9 compliance, is this limited to just construction, hospitality, restaurants?
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, certainly those companies are getting NOIs. But the energy company that I just mentioned to you is a publicly traded company. And they got an NOI. Now, there are different dynamics regionally. Different ICE offices, different ICE HSI offices are going about their enforcement priorities differently. So there is a geographical component to this. But by and large, no. Being big doesn't insulate you. Being small doesn't insulate you. I mean, it is a numbers game, right? I mean, there are, I don't know how many tens of millions of employers in the United States, and there are only so many ICE officers, even with the 45 billion that they got in the latest bill. But that's still not going to equip them to go after every employer. But what is going to start happening, I think, is that as enforcement in other areas ramps up, and we've seen an increase in detentions and removals from the United States, ICE is gathering, I believe, I don't have any actual evidence of this, but my supposition is that they're collecting a lot of intelligence about where these individuals have been working and for whom. And I wouldn't be surprised if the next step or an outgrowth of the current enforcement, individual-focused enforcement, is then to take that information and build on it to begin to go after employers who are the ones who have been employing the people who were taken into detention.
Yeah, so you'll see, you think, I mean, this is my perspective as well, employers will start seeing more enforcement actions rather than just individuals.
I don't think there's any question that employers are going to see more notices of inspection and more worksite enforcement. What form that enforcement takes is going to be kind of situational, but ICE is empowered. ICE's budget has been exponentially increased. Yes, a lot of that's going to go to detention and removal, but there will also, I think, be a lot of focus on employers who are perceived to be abusing the system.
I spoke with the owner of a construction company recently, and we were talking about this issue, and he said, I use eVerify, I'm covered. What do you say to folks who, they buy a fancy widget, or maybe they use eVerify legitimately, but maybe don't have some processes in place, or they just kind of think, oh, I think we're good here?
Well, first and foremost, the statutory obligation is the I-9. If an employer uses eVerify voluntarily, that's the employer's choice. If the employer's enrolled in eVerify because the employer's obligated to be enrolled in eVerify by virtue of doing business with the government or in one of the states that mandates the use of eVerify, then they're using it. But employers who think that they're insulated from any type of real exposure or liability because they use eVerify are misguided. Frequently we see that eVerify use and I-9 compliance correlate. So an employer that is enrolled in eVerify is conscientious and is doing a good job on their I-9s. And it may very well be that their paperwork exposure on I-9s is less by virtue of using eVerify. But using eVerify doesn't excuse you from the I-9 obligation. The primary obligation is the I-9, and then eVerify is the secondary obligation. But then where employers, I think, get a false sense of security is that if they're enrolled in eVerify, then that means that the documents that they saw belong to somebody or relate to somebody who's authorized to work. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they belong to the person who presented them. And we see situations where employers say, well, I use eVerify and I'm safe. And we do an audit and we tell them, yes, you use eVerify, but X% of the documents that you looked at are fraudulent. They may relate to somebody who's lawfully authorized to work, but this isn't that person. And if you have an ICE inspection, you might avoid financial exposure on your I-9s because your I-9s look good, but you're going to have a tremendous workforce issue because you're going to need to let go X percent of your workforce very quickly.
Or the government may believe that you are intentionally hiring folks who aren't authorized to work.
The government may believe that. I mean, that's a tough case to make, just from a prosecutorial standpoint. Doesn't mean they won't try. But you need to show that an employer knowingly employed somebody who was unauthorized to work. Now, that knowledge can be actual knowledge, the person knew, the employer knew, or constructive knowledge that a reasonable employer would have known based on the facts that the person was unauthorized to work. That's a much tougher case to make as a prosecutor.
Just got done with a conversation with Eric Board from Morgan Lewis, one of the preeminent attorneys in the United States specializing in I-9 compliance as well as eVerify. We talked about a lot of subjects, but most of all, I think what impacted me the most was understanding what's going to happen in the rest of 2025 and the next couple of years during this administration around I-9 compliance. How is ICE going to be using all of these billions of dollars that came in through the big, beautiful bill? And then also, it was interesting to me hearing about how I-9 compliance can affect mergers and acquisitions, how it can break deals or delay or even destroy deals. But also, it was interesting hearing about which industries are affected related to I-9 compliance and how companies can just stay on top of it with the changing, like the very dynamic policy that's happening right now.